March 13, 1945, 5,000 feet above Osaka, Japan. Captain Paul Jones banks his B-29 Superfortress, call sign Bataan Avenger, away from the target. Below him, the city is transforming into an inferno. 16 square miles of wooden buildings, workshops and homes igniting simultaneously. The heat rising from below hits the bomber like a physical wall. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Then the world inverts. The 30-ton aircraft lurches skyward, hurled upward by a thermal column so violent it defies physics. Jones watches, paralyzed, as his airspeed indicator needle spins wildly. The instrument panel goes dark. His co-pilot's hands are ripped from the controls. Through the cockpit glass, where flames should be below, Jones now sees them above. The Bataan Avenger, brand new from the Boeing factory just 7 days earlier, is flying, upside down. Debris rains up from what should be the floor. Cigarette butts, sand, oxygen masks, everything loose in the fuselage now hangs in the air above the crew's heads as they dangle in their harnesses. The bomber is in a death spiral. 5,000 feet becomes 4,000, 3,000. Jones has maybe 15 seconds before his aircraft augers into the burning city below and becomes one more crater in the devastation. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of it. The B-29 Superfortress wasn't designed to fly at 5,000 feet over enemy territory. It was built to operate at altitudes where other aircraft couldn't reach, where crews could work in shirtsleeves while flying 6 miles above the earth, where Japanese fighters would struggle to climb and anti-aircraft guns would fire blind. The B-29 represented the single most expensive weapons program in World War II, $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project, more than the development of radar or the proximity, fuse. Boeing had created a bomber that shouldn't exist, a machine so technically advanced it redefined what was possible in 1944. 4 Wright R335O duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, the most powerful piston engines ever mounted on a production aircraft. A pressurized fuselage, something no other heavy bomber possessed. Dual remote-controlled gun turrets operated by a single gunner and a fire control computer. A bomb bay capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of ordnance. An operational range exceeding 3,000 miles. The pressurization system alone was revolutionary. Crews could fly at 30,000 feet while experiencing cabin pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet elevation. No oxygen masks required for most of the flight. No freezing temperatures. The forward and rear crew compartments were fully pressurized, connected by a long tunnel that crew members could crawl through if necessary. The bomb bays remained unpressurized to avoid the complication of depressurizing before opening the doors mid-flight. When test pilot Eddie Allen took the XB-29 prototype up for its first flight on September 21, 1942, he was flying a bomber that belonged to a different decade. The Germans had nothing comparable. The British Lancaster, excellent as it was, couldn't operate above 20,000 feet. The B-17 Flying Fortress, workhorse of the European theatre, lacked pressurization entirely. The B-29 was designed from the outset for one mission: destroy Japan from altitudes Japan couldn't defend against. By November 1944, when the first B-29 seconds began flying combat missions from newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian and Guam, the strategic situation seemed clear. Japan was 1,500 miles away, well within the Superfortress's range. American planners had spent years developing the doctrine: high-altitude, daylight precision, bombing, the same approach that had worked, eventually, over Germany. Bombardiers would use the Norden bomb sight, an analog computer so sophisticated it could theoretically drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. Formations would fly above 30,000 feet, where Japanese interceptors would struggle to reach them. The pressurized crews would work in relative comfort while raining destruction on Japanese war industries below. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell took command of the 21st Bomber Command in August 1944. He believed absolutely in precision bombing doctrine. Identify specific industrial targets, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries. Destroy them systematically with high-explosive bombs dropped from extreme altitude. Cripple Japan's ability to manufacture war material. Force surrender without invasion. The first mission launched on November 24, 1944. 111 B-29 seconds took off from Saipan, bound for the Musashino aircraft plant on the outskirts of Tokyo. Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell flew lead in B-29 Dauntless Dottie. It was the first American bombing raid on the Japanese capital since Jimmy Doolittle's famous 16 B-25 seconds had struck in April 1942, a propaganda mission that had accomplished little material damage but enormous psychological impact. This time would be different. This was the beginning of a sustained campaign, the beginning of Japan's destruction from the air. The weather over Tokyo was terrible. Heavy cloud cover obscured the target. Navigators struggled to find landmarks through the overcast. Of the 111 bombers that departed Saipan, only 24 actually dropped bombs anywhere near the intended target. The rest hit alternate targets or brought their bombs home. Reconnaissance photos showed that fewer than 50 bombs landed within 1,000 feet of the Musashino plant. Production continued, uninterrupted. More missions followed through December and into January 1945. The pattern repeated: bad weather, poor bombing accuracy, minimal damage to intended targets. Crews faced brutal conditions at altitude. Temperatures at 32,000 feet dropped to 40 below zero. Even with pressurization, the B-29's heating system struggled. Ice formed on instrument panels. Gunners fought to keep their weapons functioning in the extreme cold. Then there were the engines. The Wright R3-350 engines were temperamental monsters. They overheated constantly. Cylinder heads would crack, valves would fail. Worst of all, they caught fire. The engines used magnesium alloy components to save weight, and when those components overheated, they ignited. The B-29's fire suppression system, designed in peacetime by engineers who'd never seen combat conditions, failed 87% of the time. Engine fires during takeoff killed more B-29 crews than Japanese fight fighters did in those early months. A fully loaded Superfortress, tanks topped off with fuel and bomb bays crammed with high explosives, would lumber down the runway. One engine would begin to overheat. The pilot would see the temperature gauge climb into the red. Sometimes the engine would just quit. Sometimes it would explode into flames. Sometimes the pilot could shut it down and feather the propeller and nurse the aircraft back to base on 3 engines. Sometimes the fire would spread to the fuel tanks, and the entire bomber would disintegrate in a fireball before it cleared the runway. Between October 1943 and September 1944, the B-29's in-commission rate never exceeded 40%. That meant more than half the aircraft at any given time were grounded for mechanical problems. In July 1944, only 27% of B-29 seconds were operational. By August, that number had climbed to 36%. These weren't the reliability and numbers of a mature weapons system. These were the statistics of a prototype barely ready for combat, but the mechanical problems, as serious as they were, weren't the primary reason the high-altitude bombing campaign was failing. The real problem was invisible, literally invisible, and nobody in the American military had accounted for it. Japanese meteorologists had known about it for years. They called it the Kazunotani, the Wind Valley, a river of air that flowed from west to east across Japan at high altitude, moving at speeds that seemed impossible. Western science had theorized about such winds. Some meteorologists suspected they existed, but until B-29 crews encountered them firsthand at 30,000 feet over Tokyo, nobody in the Allied command structure understood what they were dealing with. The jet stream, winds at altitude over Japan, routinely exceeded 200 miles per hour during winter and spring. Sometimes they hit 250. The B-29's cruising speed was 220 miles per hour. Do the math. A bomber flying into a 200-mile-per-hour headwind would make actual progress over the ground at 20 miles per hour. 20. A man could bicycle faster. Flying with the jet stream was almost worse. The bomber would hurtle toward the target at 420 miles per hour relative to the ground below. The Norden bomb sight, brilliant as it was, couldn't compensate for that kind of ground speed. Bombs dropped from 6 miles up while traveling at more than 400 miles per hour would sail past the target by miles. And the jet stream didn't flow uniformly. It twisted, it meandered, it changed altitude. The lead bomber in a formation might be flying through winds of 100 miles per hour, while the trailing aircraft encountered 180 mile per hour winds. Formations would stretch out across miles of sky, each aircraft fighting different wind conditions, bombing accuracy completely, disintegrating. Navigators would take a celestial fix, plot their position, and calculate that they were on course. 10 minutes later, another fix would show they'd drifted 15 miles off track. The jet stream had pushed them sideways without the crew even realizing it. By the time the formation reached the target, nobody knew exactly where they were relative to the aiming point. Weather forecasting was nearly impossible. Japan's weather systems moved in from Siberia, from territory the Americans had no way to observe. Missions would launch from the Marianas based on predictions that turned out to be completely wrong. Crews would arrive over the target to find conditions nothing like what they'd been briefed to expect. The bombing accuracy statistics told the brutal truth. In January 1945, only 12% of bombs dropped during daylight precision raids landed within 1,000 feet of the intended target. 12%. The Norden bomb site was supposed to hit within 300 feet. In practice, from 30,000 feet, through jet stream winds and weather that meteorologists couldn't predict, 88% of bombs were missing their targets by more than 1,000 feet, some missed by miles. Reconnaissance photos showed bomb craters in rice paddies, residential neighborhoods, forests, open ocean. The Nakajima aircraft engine plant that had been targeted, untouched. The Mitsubishi factory, still running 3 shifts. Japanese war production wasn't being crippled, it was expanding. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, was growing desperate. The B-29 program was his pet project. He'd risked his career pushing for it. He'd secured the funding over objections from the Navy and the Army Ground Forces, $3 billion. And after 4 months of operations, the strategic bombing campaign against Japan was accomplishing almost nothing. Arnold sent Brigadier General Lauris Norstad to Guam on January 6, 1945, to inform General Hansel that a change was coming. 2 weeks later, Major General Curtis LeMay arrived to take command of 21st Bomber Command. LeMay was 38 years old. He'd earned his reputation as a hard taskmaster leading the 3rd Air Division in England. He'd previously commanded 20th Bomber Command, flying B-29 seconds out of bases in China and India. He came to the Marianas as a proven combat commander. He emerged from the war as something more, a strategist who would reshape American air power doctrine for the next generation. LeMay looked at the statistics and reached a conclusion that seemed insane. The B-29, the most technologically advanced bomber ever built, the aircraft designed specifically for high-altitude operations, was being used wrong. The pressurization system, the revolutionary feature that had cost millions to develop, the system that allowed crews to fly comfortably at 30,000+ feet, was irrelevant. Everything the B-29 was designed for, LeMay was about to throw away. He'd been studying reconnaissance photos of Japanese cities. What he saw changed his understanding of the target. Japan's war production wasn't concentrated in large factories like Germany's. It was dispersed through cottage industries, small workshops scattered through residential neighborhoods. A house that looked like a house might have a workshop in the back, producing ball bearings or electrical components or aircraft parts. Destroy one factory and production would shift to dozens of small facilities. You couldn't kill Japanese industry with precision bombing. You had to burn entire neighborhoods. Japanese cities were made of wood and paper, bamboo frameworks, rice paper walls, tile roofs over timber structures. Tokyo had burned to the ground after the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. 23 years later, it had been rebuilt with the same materials. It would burn again. All of it would burn. LeMay studied the British experience. RAF Bomber Command had spent years developing incendiary tactics against German cities, Hamburg, Dresden. The British had learned how to create firestorms. Start enough fires close together, and they would coalesce into a single massive conflagration that created its own weather, its own winds, its own unstoppable destruction. The Americans had the weapons, the M69 incendiary bomb, a small cluster weapon that released 38 individual bomblets. Each bomblet contained napalm, gelatinized gasoline that stuck to surfaces and burned at temperatures that would melt steel. The E-46 cluster bomb could carry 40 M69s in a single unit. One B-29 could carry dozens of cluster bombs. But to use incendiaries effectively, you had to fly low. Bombing from 30,000 feet with incendiaries was useless. The clusters would spread too wide. The fires would be scattered, easily controlled by firefighters. You needed concentration. You needed to put thousands of fires in a confined area in a very short time. That meant flying at 5,000 to 7,000 feet. LeMay's staff thought he'd lost his mind. Fly the B-29 seconds at 5,000 feet, within range of every anti-aircraft gun in Japan, within range of 50 caliber machine guns. The Japanese could throw rocks and hit them at that altitude. It was suicide. Then LeMay added another element that made the plan seem even crazier. Strip the guns. Remove all defensive armament except the tail gun. Save weight. Carry more bombs. The gunners protested. The pilots protested. Fly over Japan at low altitude in an unarmed bomber, at night when fighters would be waiting. This wasn't a tactical adjustment. This was mass sacrifice. LeMay had done the calculations. Japanese night fighter capability was weak. Their radar network was inadequate. Their anti-aircraft batteries were designed for high-altitude defense. At low altitude, at night, tracking and engaging fast-moving bombers would be nearly impossible. The Japanese would be as blind as the Americans had been trying to bomb through clouds at 30,000 feet. And the Americans wouldn't be bombing blind. Pathfinder aircraft would go in first, marking the target with napalm bombs. They'd create a giant X of flame visible for miles. Follow-on waves would simply aim for the fires. No Norden bombsight required, no complex calculations. See the flames, drop the bombs, turn for home. On the afternoon of March 9th, 1945, crews gathered for mission briefing on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. When they learned the details, altitude 5,000 feet, guns stripped, night attack, some men were certain they'd been ordered to their deaths. One waist gunner on a B-29 called Starduster packed all his belongings into his B-4 bag and left them neatly arranged on his cot. He told his crewmates he was looking at his possessions for the last time. LeMay watched the first B-29 seconds take off from Guam as daylight faded. He'd committed everything to this mission. If it failed, if losses were catastrophic, his career was over. More importantly, the strategic bombing campaign might be finished. The invasion of Japan would proceed as planned. Hundreds of thousands of American casualties, maybe millions. He told Street. Claire McKelway, a reporter shadowing him, "If I am sending these men to die, they will string me up for it." 334 B-29 seconds launched that evening. It took 2 hours and 45 minutes for all of them to become airborne. The largest single bomber mission in the Pacific War. They flew north through the darkness, navigating by dead reckoning and celestial fixes, 1,500 miles of open ocean between them and their target. The Pathfinders reached Tokyo shortly before midnight, 4 B-29 seconds carrying extra fuel, additional radios, and the best radio operators in 21st Bomber Command. They circled at 25,000 feet, above the chaos they were about to unleash, guiding the waves of bombers below. The lead pathfinders dropped their M47 bombs in a massive X pattern centered on the Shitamachi district, Tokyo's working-class neighborhood near the docks. Dense population, wooden buildings packed together with narrow streets between them, perfect conditions for fire. The X ignited immediately, 40-foot flames visible from 50 miles away. The following waves of B-29 seconds didn't need navigators. They just flew toward the glow on the horizon. 279 bombers dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo in approximately 2 hours. The M69 bomblets punched through thin roofing material or landed on streets and ignited 3 to 5 seconds later, regurgitating jets of flaming napalm that spread across everything they touched. Wood, paper, fabric, human flesh. Individual fires coalesced within minutes. The heat created updrafts that sucked in fresh oxygen and from surrounding areas. Winds began to blow toward the fire center from all directions. 20-mile-per-hour winds, 30, 40. The firestorm was generating its own weather system. Temperatures in the center of the conflagration reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass, hot enough to vaporize water. People caught in the fire didn't burn to death. They suffocated as the flames consumed all available oxygen. Carbon monoxide concentrations reached lethal levels within seconds. Civil defense broke down completely. Fire departments designed to handle peacetime blazes or scattered bomb damage were overwhelmed. Fire trucks couldn't reach burning neighborhoods because the streets were blocked by fleeing civilians. Water mains burst from the heat. Firefighters abandoned their equipment and ran. The B-29 crews flying over the target saw a vision of hell. Richard Bale of the 9th Bombardment Group said he could almost read a paper in his cockpit from the light out of the fires below. The glow was visible from 150 miles away. Crews who'd been skeptical about the low-altitude approach realized, watching Tokyo burn, that LeMay had been right. This was working. This was destruction on a scale beyond anything they'd imagined. But the fires created their own danger. The heat rising from 16 square miles of Inferno generated thermal columns of staggering power. Hot air rising at hurricane velocity. The late waves of bombers, arriving over the target 30 minutes or an hour after the initial attack, flew into turbulence like nothing they'd experienced. Aircraft would suddenly drop 1,000 feet, then lurch upward 1,500 feet in seconds. Wings would flex beyond their designed limits. Crews would be thrown against bulkheads. Equipment would tear loose. Some pilots lost control entirely, spiraling toward the flames below, before managing to recover at the last moment. The smell penetrated the aircraft. Even at 5,000 feet, even with oxygen masks, crews could smell burning wood, burning fabric, burning flesh. Maynard David, a bombardier, recalled that when the bomb bay doors opened, the plane filled with smoke from the ground, and the horrible odor washed over them. Men vomited into their oxygen masks. They kept flying. They dropped their bombs. They turned for home. 27 B-29 seconds didn't return. Some were shot down by anti-aircraft fire or the handful of Japanese night fighters that managed to engage. Some suffered mechanical failures. Some were caught in the massive updrafts and thrown out of control, crashing into the burning city or the ocean beyond. A loss rate of 8%, higher than LeMay wanted, but far lower than the catastrophic casualties he'd feared. The fires burned until morning. When reconnaissance aircraft flew over Tokyo the next day, they photographed devastation that defied comprehension. 15.8 square miles of the city destroyed. 16 square miles reduced to ash and rubble. 100,000 Japanese dead. 1 million homeless. 7% of Tokyo's total area gone in a single night. It was the single most destructive bombing raid in human history. More destructive than Dresden. More destructive than Hamburg. More destructive than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that would come 5 months later. And it was just the beginning. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. LeMay gave his crews 3 days to rest and rearm. Then he sent them back. March 13th, Osaka. March 16th, Kobe. March 19th, Nagoya again. 5 major incendiary raids in 10 days. 1,595 B-29 sorties. 9,365 tons of incendiaries. 32 square miles of Japanese cities destroyed. The Osaka raid on March 13th was when the Bataan Avenger flew its first and nearly last mission. Captain Paul Jones and his crew were part of the 6th Bomb Group launching from Tinian. They were among the last aircraft to depart, the least favoured position because the fires set by forward planes meant severe thermal turbulence for those that followed. The Osaka Army Arsenal was a primary target. 150 acres of manufacturing facilities, including a steel mill, chemical plant, and production lines for guns, shells, bombs, and explosives. 274 B-29 seconds reached the target just after 3:30 in the morning. They released their incendiary clusters by radar at a ground speed of 300 miles per hour from 5,000 feet. The turbulence was bad. Light cloud cover obscured some visibility. The fires from earlier waves had already created thermal columns, invisible rivers of superheated air rising from the burning city. Jones banked the Bataan Avenger away from the target, turning for the coast and safety. That's when the arsenal exploded. Nobody saw it coming. Maybe a lucky hit from one of the B-29 seconds. Maybe secondary explosions as the fires reached stockpiled ammunition. The explosion was massive enough to register on seismographs. The shockwave and thermal column hit the Bataan Avenger like a physical blow. The 30-ton bomber was hurled upward 5,000 feet in seconds. G-forces pinned the crew to their seats, then threw them against their harnesses as the aircraft inverted. The cockpit lights went dark. All instruments failed. Jones felt his hands ripped from the controls. He looked at the airspeed indicator, saw the needle pointing to 60, and assumed they were going 160 miles per hour and approaching a stall. They'd fall out of the sky upside down. Then he realized the needle was unwinding. Backward. They weren't doing 160. They were doing 360. Upside down, in a slow roll, diving toward the burning city. He could see people running through fenced yards below, trying to escape the fire. He estimated they were no higher than 600 or 700 feet above the ground. Jones and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Hurd, fought the controls. The ailerons were warped from the stress. The elevator controls felt mushy, delayed. They managed to stop the roll, level the wings, pull out of the dive. The nose came up. The flames that had been above them through the canopy were now where flames should be, below. Staff Sergeant Thomas, looking forward from his station, had said his final prayers. He'd been certain they were going to die. Then, impossibly, the pilots recovered. The bomber climbed. They crossed the coast at 15,000 feet and set course for Tinian. That's when they discovered the damage. The airframe had been stressed beyond its design limits. The engines were running rough, requiring power settings that burned fuel at twice the normal rate. The only airstrip between Japan and Tinian was Iwo Jima, where Marines were still fighting to secure the island. They might not have enough fuel to reach even that. Jones informed the crew they had 2 choices: bail out over Iwo Jima, either onto the island where the battle was still raging or into the ocean, or attempt a landing on a very short runway pockmarked with shell holes from the recent combat. The crew elected to stay with the aircraft. They limped to Iwo, gear down, flaps down, nursing the damaged bomber toward the emergency strip. The landing was rough but successful. Ground crews told them that a B-29 that had landed there a day earlier had ended up in one of the shell holes. Boeing issued a news release soon after about the inversion, calling it a strong thermal updraft from the firebombing. Robert Ripley published a cartoon about the incident in his widely syndicated Ripley's Believe It or Not newspaper panel on October 26, 1945. He called it the Flashlight Miracle, referring to how Jones used a flashlight to see his instruments when all electrical power failed and realized they were traveling at 360 miles per hour, not 160. The Bataan Avenger survived. It served briefly as a training aircraft and eventually as an air tanker before being decommissioned. It was never returned to its sponsors in Junction City, Kansas, who'd raised $500,000 in war bonds to earn the right to name it, choosing Avenge Bataan to honor the victims of the Bataan Death March in April 1942. The crew's experience wasn't unique. Multiple B-29 seconds were flipped upside down during the firebombing raids. Captain Gordon Robertson and his 29th Group crew, flying their first mission over Tokyo on March 9th, were caught by searchlights at 5,600 feet and nearly blinded. As they turned away after bombing, incredible updrafts lifted their aircraft 5,000 feet in seconds. The Superfortress felt, Robertson said, like a cork on water in a hurricane. His bomber rolled, wings tilting past vertical. Debris rained inside the fuselage. Sand, cigarette butts, oxygen masks, everything loose falling from what should be the floor. The crew realized they were upside down when they saw the fiery world below suddenly appear through the top of the cockpit canopy. It was a chilling sensation, Robertson said later. The physics were straightforward. A fully developed firestorm creates its own weather system. As buildings burn, heated air rises rapidly through what's called the stack effect. Multi-story buildings act like chimneys, draining cool air from ground level and forcing it upward through the flames. As more ground air is sucked into the conflagration, the firestorm spreads of its own accord. A firestorm generates cyclonic winds. The superheated air rises so fast it creates updrafts of hurricane velocity. Those updrafts extend thousands of feet above the burning area. Aircraft flying over an active firestorm encounter vertical wind speeds that can exceed 100 miles per hour. A B-29 cruising at 220 miles per hour can be thrown upward or downward faster than the pilots can react. The turbulence would cause altitude changes of 1,000 feet, up or down, in seconds. Some aircraft were thrown upward so violently that crews blacked out from the G-forces. Others dropped so suddenly that men not strapped in were thrown against the ceiling. In some cases, the winds actually flipped bombers completely inverted before the pilots could recover control. Most firestorm victims on the ground didn't burn to death. They suffocated. Carbon monoxide reaches lethal levels within seconds as the fire consumes available oxygen. People would collapse from smoke inhalation and lack of oxygen before the flames reached them. Those caught directly in the fire were incinerated so quickly they barely had time to realize what was happening. Temperatures in the core of the Tokyo firestorm exceeded 1,800 degrees. The firebombing campaign continued through the spring and summer of 1945. By May, nearly every major Japanese city had been hit. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, the pattern was consistent. Pathfinders would mark the target. Follow-on waves would saturate the area with incendiaries. Firestorms would develop within an hour. Fire departments would be overwhelmed. 8 to 16 square miles would burn. Japanese civil defense authorities knew what was coming, but couldn't stop it. After the Tokyo raid, the government ordered construction of civilian air raid shelters, but there wasn't enough concrete or steel. Most families were told to dig trenches in their yards. Trenches didn't help against firestorms. The heat would reach into shelters. The carbon monoxide would seep underground. People who took refuge in basements or subway stations suffocated as the fires above consumed all available oxygen. Some Japanese cities received advance warning. Starting in late July, B-29 seconds would drop leaflets over cities warning that they would be bombed soon. The leaflets were supposed to give civilians time to evacuate. In practice, most people had nowhere to go. Japan's rail system was being targeted by the same bombers. Roads were clogged with refugees from previously bombed cities. Food supplies in rural areas couldn't support the influx of urban evacuees. On July 28th, 6 cities were attacked in a single night: Aomori, Ichinomiya, Tsu, Uji Yamada, Ogaki, and Uwajima. Smaller cities with populations ranging from 60,000 to 300,000. They burned just as thoroughly as the larger targets. On August 1st, more than 830 B-29 seconds staged one of the largest raids of the war, hitting Hachioji, Mito, Nagaoka, and Toyama simultaneously. The psychological effect on Japanese morale was devastating. Factory workers stopped showing up to facilities that might be targeted next. Production plummeted even in undamaged factories as workers fled to the countryside. Surveys conducted after Japan's surrender showed that nearly 70% of the population had reached a point where they felt unable to endure one more day of war. The strategic objective of the campaign was clear: destroy Japanese industry, cripple the economy, break civilian morale, force surrender without invasion. The tactical irony was equally clear. The B-29, designed as a high-altitude precision bomber, accomplished all of this by flying low and dropping incendiaries indiscriminately. The pressurization system that had cost millions to develop went unused during the raids that actually won the war. The sophisticated fire control systems, the analog computers that could supposedly guide defensive guns with pinpoint accuracy, were stripped out to save weight for more bombs. The Norden bomb sight, the device that was supposed to enable precision targeting from extreme altitude, became irrelevant when bombardiers simply aimed for visible fires. Everything the B-29 was designed to be, it wasn't. Everything it accomplished by doing the opposite of what its designers intended. The supreme technological achievement of American aviation in World War II achieved its greatest successes by abandoning the technology that made it supreme. Between March and August 1945, systematic raids destroyed more than 60 Japanese cities using concentrated bombing patterns that pressure, pattern navigation, and low-altitude tactics enabled. Over 32 square miles of highly populated and industrialized areas were burned in just the first 10 days. The campaign continued until August 14th, the day before Japan's formal surrender. American casualties during the firebombing campaign were relatively light compared to the destruction inflicted. Approximately 402 B-29 seconds were lost in operations against Japan between June 1944 and August 1945. 147 were shot down by Japanese defenses. 255 were lost to engine fires and mechanical failures. The mechanical problems killed more crews than enemy action. Japanese casualties were catastrophic. The Strategic Bombing Survey tentatively concluded that approximately 330,000 Japanese died in B-29 attacks within 14 months. The actual numbers are unknowable. For context, the Anglo-American bombing offensive in Europe killed between 500,000 and 600,000 Germans over 4 years. The B-29 campaign killed roughly half that number in less than a quarter of the time. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th combined inflicted less immediate destruction than the single Tokyo firebombing raid of March 9th. Hiroshima's estimated death toll was approximately 80,000 in the initial blast. Nagasaki's death toll was approximately 40,000. The Tokyo raid killed 100,000 in a single night. Most Americans believe Japan surrendered because of the atomic bombs. That interpretation isn't entirely wrong, but it's incomplete. The atomic bombs were psychologically devastating. The idea that a single aircraft with a single bomb could destroy an entire city represented a new kind of warfare that Japan had no defense against. But the conventional firebombing campaign had already demonstrated that American bombers could destroy Japanese cities systematically, relentlessly, night after night. By August 1945, Japan's industrial production had been cut in half. The rail system was crippled. Food distribution networks had collapsed. The civilian population was on the edge of mass starvation. The firebombing campaign, more than any other factor, had made continued resistance unsustainable. Curtis LeMay's gamble in March 1945 had worked. The low-altitude incendiary campaign accomplished what months of high-altitude precision bombing couldn't. It destroyed Japanese industrial capacity. It shattered civilian morale. It created conditions where surrender became Japan's only viable option. But the human cost was staggering. The firebombing campaign killed more Japanese civilians than any other military operation in history, except the siege of Leningrad. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Families were incinerated. Children suffocated in shelters as fires raged above them. The distinction between military and civilian targets disappeared. If a workshop producing ball bearings was located in a residential neighborhood, the entire neighborhood burned. The moral questions raised by the firebombing campaign remain contentious decades later. Was it justified to deliberately target civilian areas? Could the war have been won without burning Japanese cities? Were there alternatives that would have accomplished the strategic objectives with fewer civilian casualties? Said, "Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at that time. It was getting the war over that bothered me. The soldiers and Marines preparing for the invasion of Japan's home islands, scheduled for November 1945, would have faced Japanese resistance that casualty estimates projected in the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. The firebombing campaign, brutal as it was, may have saved those lives by making the invasion unnecessary." The legacy of the campaign shaped American strategic doctrine for decades. The principle that air power alone could force an enemy to surrender, without ground invasion, became foundational to Air Force thinking throughout the Cold War. The B-29 itself evolved into the backbone of Strategic Air Command, carrying nuclear weapons instead of incendiaries, but operating under the same strategic concept: destroy the enemy's capacity and will to fight from the air. The B-29's technological innovations outlasted the aircraft itself. Pressurization technology perfected for the Superfortress became standard on every commercial airliner that followed. Boeing's expertise in building pressurized aircraft gave them a decisive advantage in the post-war aviation market. The Boeing Stratocruiser, the Boeing 707, every passenger jet that followed owed something to the pressurization systems first proven reliable on the B-29. Remote-controlled gun turrets, fire control computers, advanced radar systems, all technologies developed for the Superfortress found applications in post-war aviation. The B-52 Superfortress, which entered service in the 1950s and remains operational today, was a direct descendant of the B-29's design philosophy: long range, heavy payload, crew comfort through pressurization. But the most important legacy of the B-29 campaign wasn't technological, it was strategic. The firebombing of Japan demonstrated that strategic bombing could achieve war-winning effects, not through precision attacks on industrial targets. Through area attacks that destroyed entire cities and broke the enemy's will to continue fighting. That lesson shaped how the United States approached conflicts for the next generation: Korea, Vietnam. The reliance on air power to achieve strategic objectives without committing ground forces became American military doctrine. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but the belief that enemies could be bombed into submission, the belief that air power could win wars, that belief came directly from the B-29 campaign against Japan. The crews who flew those missions rarely talked about them after the war. The men who'd flipped upside down over burning cities, who'd smelled the smoke from cremating bodies, who'd watched neighborhoods vanish under their bomb loads, most of them came home and tried to forget. Some succeeded. Others carried the memories for the rest of their lives. Richard Bale, who flew over Tokyo on March 9th and could read a paper from the light of the fires below, rarely discussed the mission with his family. Maynard David, the bombardier who remembered the horrible smell when the bomb bay doors opened, spoke about it only decades later when historians began interviewing B-29 veterans. Jim Marich, another crewman, told the New York Times in 2020, "We hated what we were doing, but we thought we had to do it. We thought that raid might cause the Japanese to surrender." Some crew members voiced objections to the firebombing missions but were pressured to continue. Others had no qualms, citing Japan's own atrocities. Pearl Harbor, the Bataan Death March, the bombing of Chinese cities, the beheading of American prisoners. The moral calculus of total war doesn't permit easy answers. The Japanese military had committed horrific acts across Asia and the Pacific. Japanese forces had killed millions of Chinese civilians. They'd conducted biological warfare experiments on prisoners. They'd forced captured nurses to become comfort women. The list of atrocities was long and well documented. Did those crimes justify firebombing Japanese cities? Did strategic necessity justify killing 100,000 civilians in a single night? The crews flying the missions believed it did. They believed they were shortening the war. They believed they were saving American lives by making invasion unnecessary. Whether they were right remains a question historians debate. What's not debatable is what happened. On March 13, 1945, Captain Paul Jones and his crew flew a B-29 over Osaka at 5,000 feet. The city ignited beneath them. The thermal updrafts from the firestorm caught their aircraft and flipped it upside down. They fought for control while diving toward the burning city below and somehow recovered. They landed safely at Iwo Jima with their damaged aircraft and lived to tell the story. Thousands of other B-29 crew members flew similar missions and returned home. Hundreds didn't return. Their aircraft crashed into the Pacific or augured into burning Japanese cities, or were shot down by the few Japanese fighters that managed to engage. Their names are recorded on memorials across the United States and in Japan. In Higashimurayama, Tokyo, there's a memorial for 11 American crew members killed when their B-29 crashed on April 2, 1945. A local farmer, whose land the plane crashed on, sought out the families of the fallen crewmen after the war and built a memorial in the form of a Heiwa Kannon Buddhist statue. Peace. Even in the devastation and hatred of war, someone recognized that the young men dying in those burning aircraft were sons and brothers and husbands, not monsters. The B-29 crews who flew the firebombing missions over Japan didn't set out to commit atrocities. They followed orders. They executed a strategic plan developed by senior commanders who believed, correctly as it turned out, that burning Japanese cities was the fastest way to end the war. Whether that belief justified the methods remains an open question that each generation must answer for itself. What's certain is that the B-29 Superfortress, designed as a high-altitude precision bomber with revolutionary pressurization technology, won the Pacific War by flying low and burning cities. The irony that the aircraft accomplished everything important by doing the opposite of what it was designed for is one of the strange truths of World War II. The tactical inversion, using a high-altitude bomber at low altitude, worked because Curtis LeMay understood that doctrine must adapt to reality. The literal inversions, aircraft flipped upside down by thermal updrafts from the fires they'd created, worked because pilots like Paul Jones refused to give up when their aircraft seemed doomed. Both kinds of inversion, tactical and physical, define the B-29's legacy. The bomber that was supposed to operate at 40,000 feet accomplished its mission at 5,000. The crews that were supposed to feel safe in pressurized cabins above enemy defenses succeeded by stripping their aircraft and diving into the chaos. The precision targeting system designed to hit factories from extreme altitude became irrelevant when the mission became burning entire neighborhoods. Nothing about the B-29 campaign went according to the original plan. Everything about it worked anyway. That's the final irony. The most expensive, most technologically advanced weapons program in World War II achieved success by abandoning almost everything that made it advanced. What remained was fire and determination, and young men willing to fly into hell to make the war end. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.